Hi guys. So we're at our last lecture for personality disorders, and as you can see, you're getting me fresh from yard work, but I wanted to get this done and up for you. So we're going to talk about personality disorders. So let's first talk about how personality disorders are different than some of the other disorders we've talked about. Prior to DSM-5, they actually were separated from other disorders. There were five axes of diagnosis, and one of the only things, there were a couple other things that were on axis 2 were the personality disorders. And then we did away with that for DSM-5. And so now we don't have those axes and they all get diagnosed in the same way. Um, Sorry about that. So the first thing is that these disorders are present from a very young age. They're considered lifelong disorders. One of the ways I often talk about these disorders is that all of the other disorders we've talked about are symptoms that are layered on top of the person's baseline personality, that the person has a baseline way of interacting with the world and interacting with other people that gets altered by the disorder when it's present. And that if you can kind of remove that layer of symptoms, whether that's depressive symptoms or the psychosis of schizophrenia, that if you can remove that layer of symptoms, you get back to the baseline of who the person has been in the past. And because of the nature of personality disorders, that's not quite true here. And so that's not that we want the goal is to kind of remove this layer of symptoms so we can get back to the baseline of who the person is, because in fact the symptoms are often the baseline of who the person has always been. And so the goal of treatment really is about changing some basic ways about how the person interacts with the world and how they interact with relationships. And I think that for me, that's a useful way of thinking about this. Um, so, so the other thing is that if you remember back at the beginning of the semester, and we talked about reliability and validity, and how each version of the DSM, the goal is to improve validity and reliability. And one of the ways we do that is by having more distinct categories and less overlap between categories. And the personality disorders present an interesting way of looking at this, because up until almost the moment the DSM-5 was published, it really looked like we were going to have a very significant change in how we diagnose personality disorders. And so we have 10 personality disorders, historically have had 10 personality disorders, but the inter-rater reliability for several of these disorders is very poor. And so we have 3 clusters of disorders, and within each cluster, the inter-rater reliability for the individual disorders within the cluster really is very bad. That it's really hard if you go from one clinician to the next to so I'm sorry, within each one of the clusters, the ability to distinguish between the individual diagnoses, the disorders within the cluster is really hard. So if you come see me, I might listen to your symptoms and conclude that you have borderline personality disorder, but you may go to another clinician and present the same exact symptoms, and they may see how it fits into histrionic personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. And so there was a real push to just basically have 3 diagnoses and that correspond to each of the 3 clusters, and to get rid of the 10 individual diagnoses. But in the end, people were really attached to the 10 diagnoses, the individual ones, and we kept them, though the assumption is that this will be the last version of the DSM where we'll have all 10 of these as distinct disorders. And so hopefully you know from the reading already, right? We have 3 clusters, or cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. Cluster A is characterized by what we call odd or eccentric symptoms. And these are going to have a great degree of overlap with schizophrenia, and in terms of the kinds of symptoms we see here, but also, as we'll talk about, in terms of the genetics of the disorders, that we see some correlation to family histories of schizophrenia. So we'll take a look at that. Cluster B is characterized by what we call dramatic or erratic symptoms. And there's 4 in this cluster. There's 3 in each of the others in A and C, but there's 4 in cluster B. And we'll look at those. And this is about a dramatic presentation or an unpredictable or erratic presentation. And by presentation, we're really talking about ways of interacting with the world and ways of interacting with people, relationships in your life. And then cluster C is about anxious or fearful symptoms. And here, these will remind you a great deal of the anxiety disorders that we talked about. And the difference is for all of these, from the other disorders that might have seemed similar to them, is that these are pervasive patterns. So we often define personality as persistent patterns of behavior and experiences. Those of you that have had theories of personality might be familiar with that definition. And here for these disorders, these are pervasive patterns of interacting in the world, which is different from having situations or times when you interact in some ways. These are more consistent. So we can look at each of the clusters a little bit more closely. You've each been assigned a case study that corresponds to one of these clusters. And I've asked you to think more deeply about both the specific diagnosis of the case that you have, but also to think a little bit more about the other diagnoses in your cluster. So hopefully you'll be ready to talk about those in our class discussions. So cluster A is that odd cluster, and here we have paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and they're all very, in some ways, similar. And you might see as we talk about them why there's such a degree of there's such low inter-rater reliability. But paranoid personality disorder is suspiciousness, expectations about being mistreated, secretive behavior. You could take a look at the specific criteria in your book or by looking at the DSM-5. The difference here between paranoid personality disorder or somebody who has paranoid delusions is that these aren't frank delusions. This is not somebody who thinks that the television is listening in on them. But it is somebody who interacts with other people in a way that is defined by suspicion, and somebody who lives their life in very careful ways because of perceived threat. Schizoid personality disorder, you'll see at both this and schizotypal have that schiz in their name, and that is not an accident. But schizoid personality disorder is defined by a lack of interest in interpersonal relationships. So this is not about wanting them but being too shy. It's a lack of interest in personal relationships. And also the absence of strong emotions. This is somebody whose affect is often going to look flat. And you might recognize that this looks very similar to some of the negative symptoms we talked about with schizophrenia. And you would be right about that. And genetically, there's overlap with those negative symptoms as well. And then schizotypal personality disorder is really just unusual or what might be considered eccentric behavior. These are very near psychotic behaviors, but they never quite include formal delusions or hallucinations. And so this is more about somebody who seems odd and bizarre to other people, but doesn't actually have hallucinations or delusions. Overall, this group, this cluster, is highly heritable, and there's a high degree of overlap with the genetics you and I talked about with schizophrenia, and the genetics we see in schizotypal and schizoid personality disorders, and a little bit with paranoid personality as well. And I think that the best understanding of this is probably that that people who have disorders in this cluster have a lot of the same genetics, but not enough of them to add up to the level of disruption we see in schizophrenia. So in the interest of not going over 10 minutes, I'm going to pause this video. I'm going to pause our lecture here and pick up with the rest of this in a second video. Okay?